In this last video, we're going to take a look at some of the other eukaryotic organisms that are out there and take a look at the algae and the fungi. And when we look at this process, remember we're looking at something that did not occur overnight. We're talking about 2.5 billion years before we start to see the appearance of these eukaryotic fossils. And it took another 1.5 billion years for these guys to start to head to land, and that's where we start to see our fungi and then our algae that evolved into the plants that are out there. So if we take a look at the algae that are out there, what do we see? These are photoautotrophic cells, so they are using light as their energy, and they can automatically get access to CO2 that's in their environment that's dissolved into the water. And we can find a variety of different types of algae that are out there. Some of them are single cells, like this Chlamydomonas here, and notice it does have flagella, so this is a single cell that's doing photosynthesis and using some of that energy to propel the cell throughout the water. Over here you can see a form of the algae where they've started to form a colony right here, and it's basically a whole blob of those cells that have their flagella on the outside that are used to basically propel this volvox throughout that environment there. And if you think about this, this is kind of the beginning of the formation of tissues. You're starting to get aggregates of these algae cells that are coming together and starting to form these bodies almost that can do things that are a little bit more complex than they could do as single cells. As these algae slowly went on to evolve, they split up into these different groups here that we can see when we look at our phylogenetic tree. And we divide these different groups partly based on the type of pigments that were present in the chloroplast that gave them a variety of different colors. And you can see our chlorophytes over here. These are the green algae, and then your red algae that is over here. And then your final group is the brown algae, and the diatoms have been grouped together with the golden algae sometimes, and the dinoflagellates that are also out here have been grouped with the algae because they can do photosynthesis, but the dinoflagellates are one of those weird protists that can switch to actually doing a chemoheterotrophic metabolism during the nighttime. So when we look at these, people have primarily used physical differences that were visible, but nowadays we're using genetics to distinguish groups of algae that are out there. And so these ones are different from the previous ones because now we're seeing multicellular forms that can start to do some more complex things than the single cell forms. When you look at the brown algae that is out there, the kelp is the fastest growing organism on the planet. They can grow about a meter or a yard in a single day. So they are very, very efficient with their photosynthesis and producing new structures inside of those bodies that they have. Now we're going to switch gears and go over to looking at our domain eukarya with the fungus kingdom. And these are eukaryotic cells that look like plants, but they are not. They are unicellular and multicellular. They do have cell walls, but here we find a big difference. The cell walls are not made of chitin, or they're not made of cellulose, which is long glucose chains. They're made of chitin, which is also a polysaccharide, but it's a slightly different form of a polysaccharide. It's more similar to what you would find in the bacteria peptidoglycan for the sugars there. And the other interesting thing is when you look at chitin, this is also found with animals for their exoskeleton when you look at things like insects and crabs and lobsters and those kinds of animals that are out there. In terms of the nutrition, there are a huge number of these species that are out there, but they are chemoheterotrophs. They cannot do photosynthesis, so they are very different from the algae. They are more similar to animal cells in that context. Many of the fungi that are out there are aerobes, but when you look at the yeast and some of the other kinds of organisms that are out there, they can ferment, so they can grow anaerobically in the absence of oxygen. And one of the major differences besides the cell walls that distinguishes fungi from the animal kingdom is that these organisms will actually do their digestion of their food on the outside of their cells, unlike us where we have internal digestion in our stomachs. The fungus will basically break down these big polymers by secreting what are known as exoenzymes to digest their food, and then they will absorb those nutrients. So when we look at the fungus kingdom, many of them are classified as saprobes, which are basically organisms that are decomposers that will decay organic materials in the environment that are out there. When you look at the structure and the reproduction of members of the fungus kingdom, molds or mushrooms are unlike the yeast cells that are out there that basically grow kind of like a bacteria cell that can do mitosis and meiosis. But when you look at molds, they will actually grow as these long thread-like filaments of cells that are known as hyphae. And the other kind of interesting thing is when you look at the genetics of them, these cells are haploid. So when you're looking at this mushroom over here, this is basically a big pile of cells that are out there. Under the ground, you see the haploid cells, and up above the ground is where these cells have actually fused together, and this is where you have the diploid form of it. So members of the fungus kingdom can actually make spores that can be produced either asexually through mitosis, or they can produce them sexually through meiosis. The other term that we find associated with members of the fungus kingdom is when you grow as hyphae, you tend to make this network of a whole bunch of hypha cells. You can think of them kind of like threads that make up a rug or something like that. And those threads are going to branch all over the place, and they make up what's known as a mycelium. And so that's this big structure that we see here. If you put it under the microscope, you would actually be able to see all of these long thread-like cells. And some of them are basically a continuous cell with the cell wall along the outside there. When you look at the fungi group that is out there, like I said, many of them are saprobes. They are saprobes that are decomposers. And so a lot of them are parasites or pathogens on plants that are out there. These cause a huge amount of damage to crops that are out there. We're talking about billions of dollars that are lost every year. The advantage to the environment is when a fungus is decomposing a dead plant or a dead animal that is out there, that is going to recycle the carbon and nitrogen and other elements back into the soil. So effectively, they are fertilizing and providing these inorganic nutrients so that the plants can continue to grow. The other kind of interesting thing, when you look at the fungus groups that are out there, they found that about 30% of them are parasitic, with about 50 species that are known to be parasitic in humans and other animals. And a parasite means they benefit from the relationship where they're growing symbiotically with you, but we are actually harmed as a result of that relationship. And I pulled out some examples just to show you. This is ringworm on somebody's shoulder, and unlike the name there, the worm is a misnomer. People thought it was worms under your skin that were growing out. This is a fungal infection. You start out with the initial infection in the center, and then the hyphae are actually growing out here, and so that's why you get this ring right here. This is where your body is basically waging an inflammation or immune system response to the ends of the hyphae as they're growing out there. Over here you can see what's known as a dermatophyte or a skin fungus, and effectively what's going on here is the fungus is eating this person's fingernails and toenails right there. Again, they're decomposers of organic materials. And if you think about superficial mycoses like this, is not that bad. You can try and get rid of it. But once they get underneath your skin and they start to spread systemically through your bloodstream, they're going to work their way through your body, decomposing your organs as they travel along there. This is one really weird example of a parasitic fungus that actually grows inside of ants. And they will decompose the ant, and then they will send up this reproductive structure right here that has the spores inside of it, and they're inside of this little sac, kind of similar to what we saw with the slime molds. And then that sac will pop, and it will release little spores that can float around and land on another ant, where they will start to grow and basically punch through that exoskeleton and get access to their flesh there. This isn't to say that all fungi are bad. We definitely do have some beneficial uses to fungi. We eat them. Here you can see some truffles and some mushrooms. We eat them in our cheeses that are out there. Again, that controlled rotting of milk that we're using these microorganisms to make the food a little bit more tasty. We use them in bread, beer, wine. We also produce chemicals and a variety of enzymes with them. And when I say that we produce chemicals, to give you an example, the records that I've been able to find show that in 2007, more than 1.5 million tons of citric acid were produced by basically feeding fungi sugars and growing them anaerobically inside of these massive containers. And those fungi fermented the sugars into citric acid. And that citric acid was added to your food and also to drink. So look on labels for your food and you might see what is effectively a fungus poop product. We do also use fungi that are out there because they are decomposers. We can use them in sewage treatment plants, kind of similar to what we do with the bacteria. And then there's also this other interesting thing. Because fungi are very similar to animals, we use them in the medicine industry to basically test different kinds of drugs. And if we can kill off fungi, there's a chance that we could use that to kill off cancerous cells. And one of the other big uses is fungi will produce antibiotics like penicillin that we can use to kill off various kinds of infectious pathogens like bacteria. The other kind of interesting thing when we look at fungi, remember the fungi colonized land basically at the same time algae were becoming the plant kingdom. And it turns out a lot of these fungi formed this symbiotic relationship with plant roots that were out there. And they estimate that between 80 to 90% of plants that are out there have fungi partners. And it's kind of interesting if you look at this Douglas fir seedling plot, what you can see is that there's two separate growths going on right here. Both of these seedlings were planted at the same time, only over here, these ones were planted in soil where they did not have fungus there. And these ones, the seedlings, were grown in soil that contained a fungus. And what happens is that fungus will actually grow around the roots, and sometimes it will actually grow into the root structure right there. And the fungus is going to absorb more water and minerals from the soil, and you can see that vastly increase the amount of growth of those plants. They were given more water and more nutrients so that they could grow bigger. And again, when we look at this idea of symbiosis, this relationship, you want both of these organisms to benefit from. So what is the plant getting out of this besides all those nutrients? Well, it's also going to be producing more and more sugars, and it's going to turn around and feed those sugars down to the fungus that is growing around the roots. So both of the organisms are going to benefit from this. The mycorrhizae is the scientific term for what we see when we're looking at fungus in the soil that is out there growing with the plants. And our last one is a really interesting kind of relationship that we can see in what's known as a lichen. And when you look at a lichen over here, you can see it's growing on this stone. We can find them growing on the sides of trees. And this is kind of similar to what we see with the mycorrhizae. Here you have the fungus that is growing with some sort of photosynthetic organism. And that could be either an algae or a cyanobacteria, which is a photosynthetic prokaryotic cell. And the fungus is going to provide some protection for these photosynthetic organisms so that they're not going to dry out easily. It's also going to hold them down because algae and the bacteria don't have roots where the fungus can provide kind of like a little holding spot there. The fungus can decompose some of the surrounding rock and provide minerals to the photosynthetic organism that is growing there. And again, just like with the plants, they're going to get sugar in return. The other thing that we can see with cyanobacteria is that some of them can actually fix nitrogen gas. And so they're basically going to be fertilizing that fungus there and giving them some extra nitrogen so that they can grow.